History remembers Robert E. Lee as the Confederate general who surrendered at Appomattox. But what happened to his four daughters after their father became the most famous defeated general in American history? None of them ever married. Mary Custis Lee remained a lifelong spinster, caring for her invalid mother. Annie Carter Lee died tragically young at just 23, before the war even ended. Agnes Lee lived as a recluse, turning down suitors who she believed were only interested in the Lee name. And Mildred Child Lee, the youngest, became known as Life ironically, for she never truly lived, devoting her entire existence to preserving her father's memory while her own hopes withered away. Four women whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of a legacy that half the country considered heroic and the other half considered treasonous. Today, I'm going to tell you what textbooks never taught you about the Lee children. Some rebuilt their lives from nothing, others were destroyed by their father's choices, and one of them did something so shocking that it was kept secret for over a century. Fair warning, these aren't the sanitized stories you learned in school. These are real people whose lives were shattered by history, and what they did next will surprise you. Robert E. Lee's 7 children were just kids and young adults when their world exploded. They didn't choose the Confederacy. They didn't choose to have their family name become synonymous with rebellion. They just woke up one day and discovered that half their country wanted to forget they existed. Imagine being a teenager and watching federal troops seize your family home, the same home where your father had served the U.S. Army for over 30 years. Imagine having your inheritance turned into a cemetery for Union soldiers as punishment for your father's choices. That's exactly what happened to George Washington Custis Lee, Robert Fitzhugh Lee, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, Anne Carter Lee, Eleanor Agnes Lee, Mary Custis Lee, and Mildred Child Lee. Ashton, 7 children. 7 completely different responses to carrying the most controversial name in America. Let me tell you what happened to each of them. Let's start with George Washington Custis Lee, the oldest son, named after George Washington himself. Talk about pressure. George was 29 when the war ended, a Confederate colonel who'd graduated first in his class at West Point. His future seemed impossible. Who would hire the eldest son of Robert E. Lee? For 5 years after Appomattox, George couldn't find steady work. The man who'd been groomed for military greatness was reduced to taking odd jobs, tutoring children, doing anything to support his family. But here's what's incredible about George. He never gave up on the idea that merit should matter more than your last name. In 1871, something remarkable happened. Virginia Military Institute offered George a position as professor of civil and military engineering, not because he was Robert E. Lee's son, but despite it. His former classmates and colleagues remembered that beneath the controversial surname was one of the brightest military minds of his generation. George spent the rest of his life proving that you could honor your father while building something entirely new. He became one of the most respected engineering professors in the South, mentoring hundreds of students who went on to rebuild the region's infrastructure. But his brother Rooney, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, chose a completely different path. Rooney shocked everyone by going into politics. Think about that for a second. The son of the Confederate general running for office in a country that had literally fought a war against his father. But Rooney was charismatic, intelligent, and most importantly, he understood something that many people didn't. The South needed leaders who could bridge the old world and the new one. He served 3 terms in Congress and became one of Virginia's most effective legislators, focusing on agricultural reform and veteran affairs for both Union and Confederate veterans. Now, if you think the sons had it hard, wait until you hear what happened to the daughters. In the 1860s, being an unmarried woman was already challenging. Being an unmarried woman named Lee was nearly impossible. Anne Carter Lee, the second child, was 26 when the war ended, prime marriage age by 19th century standards. But who was going to marry Robert E. Lee's daughter? Northern families saw her as the enemy. Many Southern families couldn't afford to associate with the Lee name if they wanted to rebuild their businesses and social standing. Anne never married. She spent her life caring for her aging parents and became increasingly reclusive. Friends described her as brilliant but broken, a woman who might have had an entirely different life if she'd been born with any other surname. Eleanor Agnes Lee faced similar struggles, but her response was completely different. Agnes, as everyone called her, was determined not to let her father's legacy define her entire existence. In 1870, Agnes did something that shocked Virginia society. She opened a school for girls, not a finishing school for wealthy daughters, but a real academic institution where girls could learn mathematics, science, and literature. Remember, this was when most people believed women's brains weren't capable of serious learning. Agnes faced incredible resistance. Parents worried about sending their daughters to be educated by a Lee. But Agnes was brilliant and persistent. Her school eventually became one of the most prestigious women's academies in Virginia, and she proved that sometimes the best way to overcome a controversial legacy is to create something entirely new. But the youngest daughter, Mildred, had perhaps the most heartbreaking story of all. Mildred was only 19 when the war ended, young enough that her entire adult life was shaped by being Robert E. Lee's daughter. She was engaged twice, and both engagements were broken off when the men's families intervened. Imagine having your heart broken, not because of who you are, but because of who your father was. Mildred never married and spent her life traveling between relatives, never quite finding a place where she could just be herself rather than General Lee's daughter. She died relatively young, and those who knew her said she never quite recovered from the isolation. But now I need to tell you about Mary Custis Lee, the daughter whose story was literally hidden from history books for over a century. Mary was 31 when the war ended, married to a cousin, and seemed to be living a quiet, conventional life. What historians discovered in the 1960s, when private family letters were finally made public, was absolutely shocking. Mary had been secretly corresponding with Union families throughout the war, and after. But it gets even more incredible than that. Mary was quietly funding the education of formerly enslaved children. She was using her own money, what little the family had left, to pay for books, teachers, and school supplies for black children in Virginia. Think about how radical this was. The daughter of the Confederate general was secretly supporting the very cause her father had fought against. But here's what makes Mary's story even more complex. She wasn't doing this out of guilt or political calculation. In one letter to a friend, Mary wrote, "I cannot change what Father did, but I can choose what I do. These children deserve the same opportunities my brothers had. If our family name means anything, it should mean standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Mary kept this work secret because she knew it would destroy her relationships with other family members and former Confederate supporters. But she also knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't act on her convictions. Historians estimate that Mary Lee quietly funded the education of over 200 formerly enslaved children in the decades after the Civil War. She died in obscurity, but those children grew up to become teachers, preachers, business owners, and community leaders. Mary proved that sometimes the most powerful way to honor your family is to be better than your family's worst moments. The last child I need to tell you about is Robert E. Lee, Jr., the youngest son, who was only 17 when the war ended. Rob, as everyone called him, had a choice. He could spend his life defending his father's legacy, or he could build something entirely different. Rob chose farming, not the plantation agriculture of the Old South, but something completely revolutionary, scientific farming, that didn't depend on enslaved labor. He studied crop rotation, soil science, and modern farming techniques. But here's what made Rob's approach so remarkable. He hired both black and white workers, paid them the same wages, and treated everyone with respect. Former Confederate neighbors were outraged. Some Union supporters were suspicious. Rob didn't care. By the 1880s, Rob Lee had become one of Virginia's most successful farmers and a leading voice in agricultural reform. He wrote articles for farming magazines, spoke at conferences, and mentored young farmers of all backgrounds. Rob proved that you could acknowledge your family's past without being trapped by it. He never criticized his father publicly, but he also never defended slavery or the Confederate cause. Instead, he focused on building the kind of South that could move forward. In 1890, Rob did something that would have been unthinkable 25 years earlier. He spoke at a conference on agricultural cooperation that included both black and white farmers. His message was simple: we can honor our past without being prisoners to it. The future belongs to those willing to work together. So what happened to Robert E. Lee's 7 children? They became proof that you don't have to be defined by your family's most controversial moments. Some, like George and Rooney, rebuilt their careers through merit and hard work. Others, like Agnes, created entirely new opportunities for the next generation. Mary and Rob showed incredible moral courage by quietly working to heal some of the damage their father's choices had caused. And even Anne, Eleanor, and Mildred, who struggled more with the burden of their name, lived with dignity in impossible circumstances. Here's what I find most powerful about their stories. None of them pretended their father was perfect, but none of them let his mistakes define their entire lives either. They understood something that we often forget today. You can love your family while disagreeing with their choices. The Lee children lived through one of the most divisive periods in American history, carrying a name that represented everything wrong with their society's past. But instead of being consumed by bitterness or denial, most of them found ways to be part of the solution. George became an educator. Rooney became a bridge builder in politics. Agnes empowered women through education. Mary fought for civil rights in secret. Rob modeled a new kind of Southern leadership. They proved that redemption is possible, but it requires acknowledging hard truths and doing the work to be better. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Lee children's story. You can't choose your family's legacy, but you can choose what you do with the life you're given. The next time you feel trapped by your family history, your circumstances, or mistakes you didn't make, but still have to live with, remember the Lee children. They turned one of the most controversial surnames in American history into a story about resilience, growth, and quiet heroism. 7 children, 7 different responses to impossible circumstances, but one common thread. They all found ways to build something better from the pieces they were given. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear that your family's past doesn't have to determine your future. And remember, history is always more complicated and more human than we first realize. Thanks for watching, and remember, we all get to choose what we do with the name we carry.